Some tough subjects are discussed in this episode, and if you're affected by any of this, there are some organisations listed in our show notes who can help. If you're watching this on a Content Hub laptop, visit the Health and Wellbeing link at the top of your screen for more information on mental health support, or speak to a listener.
Okay, so Jules, what is the best letter you received inside?
Can there be cards?
Yeah, that counts.
Okay, probably on my 21st birthday, the cards and the letters I received, I needed that. That was great for me. And
Love that.
They made me really emotional. Really emotional. What about you?
The best letters I got in jail was the ones from our mates that we got separated from. So when we've got transferred to other places. So when we'd write to each other, they're the best letters to find out what's happening, what he's doing and how things are going. So that was the best.
In prison letters?
In the prison. Yeah, that was
That's
good.
Cute.
Hello and welcome back to Life After Prison with Zak and Jules. As ever, we are joined by an extraordinary guest who's going to share their journey of life after prison, and today is no different. Joining us in the studio today, we have someone who is care experienced, also a recovering addict, a researcher and criminologist, and a social worker. None other than Ian Thomas. How you doing?
Good afternoon. It's good to be here.
Yeah.
It's really good to thank you.
Was that intro all right for you?
Yeah, I'm still surprised.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's a great list.
Man of many traits.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
So we are going to go straight in.
Yeah.
We want to kind of take it back and start with a question about growing up. And we wanted to know what it was like growing up in care for you. So we are going straight in.
Yeah, no, that's cool. Yeah, growing up in care, it was a confusing time. You know, it was a really confusing time. I mean, not long before I went into care, I remember being quite overwhelmed with life and just like the human condition. And I remember looking at all the other kids in my school thinking that they were pulled to one side and was told, this is the secret for living life, but whatever you do, don't tell Ian.
Wow.
I thought there was this book, this book, piece of information, a certain, post-it note or something they all got that I didn't, because I used to watch them all play and interact and engage and just join in, and I just felt at a complete loss, like I'm on the outside looking in. And I now know that I had this predisposition within me that I was projecting onto the world around me. But I went into care with that. So sort of to add more abnormality to the level of abnormality I was experiencing, normal being a tricky word to use in this day and age, but want for a better word. You know, it was tough. And for me, I was in a lot of pain. I was confused. I was really frightened. I was contending with a lot of self-debilitating belief systems about myself, and consequently my behaviour and my capacity to contain all that overwhelmment was quite limited, and therefore I would act out in ways that made it difficult for people to manage me, like many of the children I've worked with in my professional capacity. And as a result of that, there was a lot of transitions, and I lived with around 20 foster families and several children's homes.
That's an incredible amount.
That's a lot. It's a lot to take in.
Yeah.
All of those emotions that you mentioned. It's so much to handle for a kid.
Yeah.
So much input and
Yeah.
so much to deal with.
What were the circumstances that led you into care, and around what age were you?
So I was 9 years old when I went into care, and then I was about a week before my 17th birthday when I left care. In those days, they used to use language like beyond parental control. And it almost puts the onus on the child. It's the child's fault they're in that situation. Thankfully, we don't use that language anymore, but that was the cause. But the long and short of it is, my mum, who I was living with, had addiction issues.
Okay.
And her own intergenerational trauma that she inherited, and her capacity to meet my needs, just wasn't there. And how I responded to that was indicative of what was happening.
You mentioned moving to, did you say 20 different families?
Yeah.
What was that like for you as a kid? 20 different...
Well, for quite a long time, it felt like a lot more. I believed it was like 40 at one point in my life, because it just felt so much more. And it wasn't until I got my files and I looked and I counted all the different addresses in a chronology that I read, Do you know what? Every time I went to a new placement, I'd normally sit in this car with a social worker, and there would be a conversation along the lines of, look, Ian, these are new carers. Don't mess it up. Please be a good boy. You know, and I'd sit there and I go, yeah, I'm going to be good. And if you put me up to a lie detector test to say, Ian, are you going to be a good boy? I would have passed the test because I meant it. I meant it. But I didn't know at the time I was contending with an internal process that I wasn't aware of, where anything that came valuable to me, fear and anxiety of loss and abandonment would overwhelm me and create a compulsion to act out negatively. So when that new family or situation becomes valuable to me, I start to feel ambivalent, frightened, anxious, scared, and I start to subconsciously collate a catalogue of evidence in my head to justify going like that and pushing them away or acting in adverse ways to create uncertainty in the relationship until I was rejected. And then the placement would break down and I'd have to move on. And when the placement would break down, I'd feel like this sense of relief, like the weight of the world had been lifted off my shoulders, because the burden of having meaningful relationships was quite a painful process for me because I'd experienced so much loss and abandonment and rejection. But at the same time, it was deeply sad. And I think in hindsight, you know, I probably gave up on life a bit more each time, and a part of my soul died a bit more each time.
Are you only discovering this now as an adult?
Oh, I never knew none of that at the time. I couldn't rock up to the breakfast table and say, I feel really unworthy of receiving love, everybody. Do you know what I mean?
Is it quite
I didn't have that insight, you know what I mean? I spent a lot of money on therapy, mate. This has cost a few quid. Yeah.
I mean, but the stuff that you're saying, that must have taken time.
We spoke earlier before, and you mentioned that you were arrested 35 times.
Yes, I was a busy boy.
From the age of 10 and a bit.
10.5.
10.5.
Yeah.
Tell us about the first arrest.
So as soon as I became, because of the Jamie Bolger serious case review, that's what brought the age down in this country to be able to be arrested at 10.5.
That's young. I did not know that.
Yeah. It shocked the nation, and that was the response. And I do think it was a reaction over a response, but nonetheless, that then put me in a position of being in a children's home at 10 years old. In those days, the staff used to use a lot of restraint tactics, you know, which would now be very questionable, you know.
They are questionable.
Yeah. I mean, so much so, they go from restraint tactics to non-violent intervention, which, you know, kind of points towards prior. We used to do violent intervention. No wonder we ended up in prison scrapping. Anyway, So yeah, and there was a whole process of, like, you know, trying to evade the restraint process and barricading doors and getting staff out. And I had a chair leg, and I hit a staff member over the head with a chair leg.
As a 10-year-old, as a
10-year-old, in an attempt to evade being restrained. I mean, it wasn't a nice
because you was afraid. You were afraid.
I was
right?
terrified. I was terrified. So, and then we managed to get out the window. We ran off into the estate. It was on the big edge of a big council estate in this where we lived, and then, you know, the police picked us up and they arrested me, and then that was my first charge, was assault.
See, what's quite confusing for me is you're 10 years old. You're in care. And obviously you've had this reaction because you were told, I'm assuming, correct me if I'm wrong, that you're going to be restrained, or you knew that's what's going to come
Well, that
next.
was the status quo, yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
So was it ever seen as, what's the actual issue here? Or was it like, no, we have to treat him as a criminal, basically?
Well, I remember being in this van and then, you know, being in a police station and looking at this, like, desk that seemed like really high at the time. And I got pinched in the same city many years later, and I thought, that desk has shrunk.
Things look bigger when you're young. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, everything's smaller now, you know what I mean? It's like when you go back to primary school and you see the tiny toilets, you know what I mean? It's like,
how was I sitting here? I know what you mean.
What were they putting in my milk? You know what I mean? So yeah, but I mean, if I'm honest, I was so disassociated. Like, when I was about 8 years old, I had a very difficult altercation with my mum, and something switched in my brain, and I intellectualized life, and I cut off, and I stopped feeling life. It wasn't a conscious response, but I was conscious of it at the time.
Wow,
And,
at 8?
Yeah, and I knew that it was no longer safe to feel. And from that moment on, I did everything I could not to feel. Wow. And that's why I talked about trauma, and the first thing we give up is our authentic self. Mm. But the pathway, or part of the pathway to recovery from trauma, is trying to be authentic. And trying to be authentic, you know, to be authentic, we have to be vulnerable. Yeah. Because if we're not vulnerable, we're sending our representative. And you know, they say that the longest journey in the world is just 12 inches, and that's from your head to your heart. And I can really relate to that, like trying to live here and not live in here, where all the projections and conditioning and societal, personal, macro, micro, you know, because that can be a frightening place for me. And I have to work really hard every day to not let that take over, you know, which is a big part of my rehabilitation.
Love that.
I mean, yeah, that's like, you're working hard on yourself every single day, which is great. Mm. So after that first arrest, what was it like with the other arrests?
It became normal. Like right, that was a go-to response. I mean, we know that there's sort of 85,000 people in prison at any given time. You know, there is data ranging from 24 to 27% of the 85,000 people have got care experience. Yep. They're former looked after children. The government are their corporate parent. Yep. It's well referenced in most of the literature that kind of covers this topic. And I was one of those. And there's a lot of criminalizing children in care. I advocate hard on this stuff. And I was one of those children. You know, it's whenever something went wrong at the children's home, as soon as I was legally, criminally responsible, you know, and I could be held accountable lawfully for expressing symptoms of my trauma, you know, because that's what was happening. I was arrested, and by the time I was 12, I had about 15 offences for burglary, theft, criminal damage.
And you would say that the offending was, you know, from growing up in care?
Oh, most definitely. Like I didn't have people around me to go, it's going to be okay and we've got you. Like, I understand that it must be really difficult for you right now, and I can see that you're really hurting, and that makes me feel really sad, and I really want to help you.
Didn't have the guidance, the role
models. No, it was just, people were just compulsively reacting to my compulsive reactions to my own suffering.
What does that do to a person?
Well, I think it creates a lot of distrust. It's really difficult to believe in society. It's really difficult to believe in people and humanity. And I think that kind of perpetuates, and it also perpetuates the belief systems, because, you know, our belief systems are the engine that drives our behavior. And I had a belief system that I was unworthy of love. No one could, should, would, or love me. And when I behaved in ways that was the engine was driving that behavior, I'd be arrested, rejected from society, which confirms all those negative belief systems, put on a conveyor belt called the criminal justice system, and penalized. And there was no healing in that. There was no opportunity for emotional responsibility. There was no acknowledgement of my suffering and my pain. It was a mess. And
what else was going on in your life, you know, whilst this is happening? You know, you're accumulating these offences, let's say, because of the trauma you've been going through. What else was going on around you or in your life?
So I was living in a children's home, and then in and out of foster care, and travelling around different foster families.
Up until the age of?
Until the age of about 12.
Oh, okay.
And then I had about 6 moves in 8 weeks.
Wow.
Yeah. Like they just couldn't keep me still. And by now, like I'm really, like I'm off the wall. Like
You're not having anything.
I'm just not very difficult to engage, smashing up my bedroom, just going crazy, you know, just really just so dysregulated inside, you know, and eventually they put me in a secure setting to keep myself safe, because I couldn't keep myself safe. And that's the language we used to use was, well, children can't keep themselves safe. It's the adult's responsibility to keep children safe. And that sort of like, it's a justification for institutionalization, which isn't helpful. And then from there to a children's home in the Kent area, and then I went from there to a foster placement on the Isle of Wight, and I kind of settled down for a few years. By the time I was sort of 12, 13, I was exhausted. I was done. I didn't have much left in me, and I'm already like using drugs at this point. And
at that age,
10, I took my first drug. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Class A drug as well.
Class A?
Yeah. Amphetamine. And it was just kind of available to me through, because in the children's home I was the youngest one. They were all like 15, 16.
Okay.
And they were seasoned, and I was going off with them and getting involved in, you know.
All sorts, yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
So there was just no boundaries. There was no safety. I just constantly felt exposed to danger. And I at no cost could I feel that. So I would just invest in the chaos and to feel a sense of control over my situation. Because when we
at a 10-year-old, you don't know what the right decision, wrong decision is. And
well, I'm 38 now and I'm still struggling with that.
Especially
so are you, Jules.
Yeah, exactly. When you're trying to deal with all that trauma. So it's a lot.
And you know what? I was, in my professional capacity, I was working for a fostering agency some years ago. And I remember working with a 10-year-old boy, and I remember looking at him and I couldn't believe how small he was. And I just made this connection to him and my 10-year-old self. And I had to kind of check myself, because it really, when it just...
It hits you.
I was that size,
well, if you
that
think
age,
about a 10-year-old and how they behave and what they're like it's young. Do you know what I mean? It's young.
I was speaking to my 10-year-old niece yesterday on FaceTime, and I was like, you're actually 10. You're just little.
When you hear them speak and the conversations they have with you, you remember that you are an adult and they are a kid. So you going through that it's not really what you should have been going through.
If it's okay with you, can you take us through how the drug addiction began, please?
So I was in a children's home, and there was a girl that was quite a few years older than me, and she used to go and visit this guy who was a drug dealer, and that gave us access, and we took amphetamine, and that was that. And substance misuse is we live in a culture that has a lot of drugs. We live in a strong drug culture. Prison is indicative of that. It's an amplified version, right?
Unfortunately.
Yeah. But for me, what I was contending with was addiction. So although I kind of went from sort of amphetamines and cannabis and the rave scene and all the party drugs to a street homeless drug addict with crack and heroin use, for me it was about addiction. But my addiction would manifest in so many other ways. So it was drugs, stealing, like getting a chase on the estate. Do you know what I mean? For the buzz. Drinking, fruit machines, all of that sort of stuff. And even as an adult, I've been in recovery since my early 20s, and I still live with addiction: cars, motorbikes, houses, money. Do you know what I mean? It's exhausting.
There's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
You mentioned, the journey through the different kind of drugs that you took and where it led you. Yeah. How does it go from a 10-year-old trying amphetamines to, like, as you said, being street homeless on, heroin?
How old were you when it got to like that stage?
Yeah. So I left the care system, and I had this sort of like, I was bitter about crack and heroin. I had this sort of real idea that I would never go there because I'd seen what it had done to people close to me. And I remember someone saying to me once, "Don't hate it too much, Ian, because that will feed it." And I didn't know what he meant, you know what I mean? But I do now. And but at no cost could I be with myself. I just couldn't be with myself. Like I was escaping this, like just this deep sense of sadness inside of me that just felt so inconsolable, and I couldn't be with it. And anything to not be with that sadness, I would do.
Okay.
And drugs were an easy go-to for me. They were my painkiller. And class A drugs, you know, for me, it was the coke and the pills and the parties and all of that. But before long, I was using alone a lot, you know, and kind of, it just kind of progressed. And part of my addiction was about selling drugs, but don't get it twisted. I wasn't a G. I was a 2-bob junkie. Do you know what I mean? You know, I have to remember that. I have to remember where it takes me. Do you know what I mean? But part of that involved that, and then that opens up avenues, doesn't it, for you? And then you get access to all sorts of different stuff, you know. And eventually, I found myself selling heroin, but not using it. And then I started using it. And
how old were you?
17, 18, and then
that's still young as well.
Yeah. And then, you know, and then and I'm selling drugs of different types, and then I'm my best customer, you know, and that's a problem, you know, and then like that spirals and all the while I can't be with this sadness. I didn't know this at the time. Do you know what I mean? I just, you know, addiction's about an obsession, you know, an obsession of the mind, a thought that excludes all other thoughts and then creates a compulsion to act out on that obsession,
I hear you.
Causing endless loops of self-destructive behavior patterns. And again, you're enslaved to that obsession. And the word addiction has Latin roots of addictus, and addictus in Latin means slave. And in sort of like, you know, the Roman times, if you couldn't pay a debt, or you created a criminal, you know, offense, you know, you would be sentenced to addictus and you would be enslaved, you know, and so that's where addiction comes from. You're enslaved to your addiction. Interesting, isn't it?
Super.
Yeah, man. Yeah,
super.
And trauma, while we're on it, comes from the Greek word wound.
Okay.
Wow.
So trauma is a wound. That's what it is.
That's why you go to a trauma ward if you've had an injury.
Which, we go. If we call it wound, it sounds like it needs to be healed, but
Precisely.
You know, trauma doesn't. It's just like, oh yeah, they've been. Okay, it's not always like this, but it's more like, oh yeah, it's trauma. But a wound is like, yeah, that's something that needs to be healed. You know?
Can we do that? Can we go there?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's go.
Go on.
Okay, so trauma is a psychological wound. That's what it is. It's like that, you know, and trauma isn't what happens to you. Trauma is about what happens to you and how that affects you.
Yeah.
You know, if we both cross the road and we get run over by a bus, God forbid we don't, and then I come out and I'm scared to cross the road, but you're not, what's the difference?
It's how we react.
I'm traumatized, you're not. And I've got post-traumatic stress. Yeah. Maybe while you were in hospital, you know, someone came and gave you grapes, brought you some flowers, and listened to you talk about your experience and help you process it. Yeah. So trauma is unprocessed grief, loss, bereavement. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So just to take us back to the timeline, tell us about the circumstances that led to you going into prison.
So I was 18 years old. I was homeless, but sofa surfing, holding down a job, using a lot of drugs still, agency work, just always trying to get my shit together, but never managing to do it. Like the unmanageability would always prevail, and I was just, things were falling apart. And my thing was cars and driving, because cars and driving allowed me to
another form of escape.
No, it was part of driving cars illegally, and you know, allowed me to do other things.
Okay, yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
It was like a doorway, a gateway.
Yeah. And it was a buzz as well. Do you know what I mean? And I've been disqualified 5 times. And I had no license prior to that. You know, I wasn't a good criminal.
Neither was I.
You know,
joined the club.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Anyway, I got nicked for driving whilst disqualified. I had a big car crash. I was joyriding this car, and they didn't bail me because there was no fixed abode. And I went to Dorchester and then to Portland, YOY, 4 months due to. I had no visits.
Portland's right by the coast, isn't it?
Yeah.
Seagulls.
Yeah, you're looking out your window, and there was slop out then as well. Yeah, man. Yeah, right at the end, I caught the end of it. Yeah, so you have to do a Brad Pitt in a bucket, which wasn't great, you know.
Definitely not. I'm super glad I wasn't in prison them times.
Yeah, and they had this thing called sanitation where you could push the button and get out, and
they still got that, you know. Yeah. They still got that in certain prisons that don't have the toilets in the cells. Yeah.
But it was. You know, and I was 18, and that's when I learned to read. I didn't learn to read or write until I was about 18.
Wow.
Seriously. And I could, you know, read like the big words in the shops when I'm sat on buses like Woolworths and stuff like that, Sainsbury's. I used to try and like make work, you know, but I had no GCSEs or... So prison was where I read my first book, and it was the book was called The Last Days of a Condemned Man by Victor Hugo, which is a classic.
What a first book.
Yeah, man. Yeah.
That's serious, but that's proper quality reading.
You know, have you read it?
No, I haven't, but I've always been, it's always been recommended. It's always been recommended.
And you know what I didn't know, like what really threw me was that actually you could get immersed in a book and it would catapult you into this abstract world that would evoke all these thoughts and feelings and kind of like shape your psychological constructs as you delve into each page.
So you learned to read in prison?
Well, I could read, but it was very patchy. And when I read that book, it was patchy. And I read it and then read it straight again the second time because I could make sense of enough to keep me going, to keep me engaged. Yeah. And the second time I read it, I remember feeling really emotional on a certain part that was quite a sad part. And I couldn't believe how I was able to get in touch with all of these feelings in a cell on my own with a book that I could only read like partially. Was
that your only prison sentence?
No.
So this was the last prison sentence?
No, this is the first.
This was the first prison sentence, sorry.
I was naughty,
No, I'm just getting my timeline right. Yeah. So it was your first sentence and you were reading and it was for a few months.
Yeah.
Okay.
There were 6 sentences.
Okay. Okay. And how long were they usually?
So, you know, like 4 to 6 months each and you know, in and out. And then the last one was sort of 3 years.
And other than, so you found your reading, what else was prison like for you? How did you deal with it? What was going on?
I did lots of press ups.
Okay.
As you do.
Yeah. Love that.
Cell workouts. Yeah. What did I get out of it? You know what? I always used to put on weight, which I think is quite sad. I think if I went to prison now, I'd lose weight. You know?
It's different now, isn't it?
Yeah. I used to put on weight. When I used to get pinched and I knew I was going to prison, I used to feel this sense of relief come over me. Because when I was out there, it was so chaotic. You know, like there was just so much chaos all the time, like just the chase and the obsession to use drugs and all the consequences I'd be building up around me. And then when they let me out, I remember feeling like I didn't really want to go.
Damn.
But I was never honest about that because it's not fashionable to be honest about that in prison, is it?
No.
Listen, lads, I want to plot up here and stay a bit longer. You know what I mean? Yeah. Everyone wants to get back on the road and, you know, and all that gear. And I remember the first time I got out, I remember kind of thinking, I don't want this. And I got out anyway, and then I was in, out, and then I got into the gym, and so my thing was, I'm going to put on weight, I'm going to go to the gym, I'm going to eat 3 meals a day, and the truth is, the truth is that nobody could hurt me more than I could hurt myself, and when I went to prison, I knew that to some degree I was protected from myself, because I didn't know how to manage life outside. I just didn't have the tools. I had a lot of pain, but I didn't have the tools, and the pain dictated much of what I did. And my last sentence, I was being sentenced for a Section 18 GBH, and I was told I was going to get like 4 or 5 years by my barrister, and secretly I was feeling excited inside, thinking I'm going to be all right. I'm going to get looked after. Do you know what I mean? Because I'm going to go to prison.
Wow.
And I remember he gave me 3 years, and I had this judge, and he, you know, and I mean, even the prosecution felt sorry for me on that day, you know, and I remember this overwhelming sense of disappointment. And I remember thinking, what am I going to do when I get out? Where am I going to go? And like many young people that come out of the care system, you know, that go to prison, they don't have much when they get out, you know, and there's not much to come out to. And that is the definition of being institutionalized. Like prison was just like another care home to me. wasn't like loss of liberty. It was like, that's where I go to get cared for now, because I still need to be cared for, because I didn't get cared for properly by the other part of the institution that I was in.